Hi, today's July 14, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me today Nick Hudson, the head of PANDA. Tell us, what is PANDA? How did you form it? What it's about?
PANDA is an organization that was formed back in May of 2020 when we, sitting in South Africa, as I am right now in beautiful Cape Town, which is starting to turn its lights on behind me. I and a few friends were alarmed at the prospect of lockdowns being rolled out in developing countries. And we thought that there'd be no public debate and no form of cost-benefit analysis performed. It's all well and good for people who have the Zoom class to talk about isolating and stay-at-home kind of situation. But in developing countries, that's just a ridiculous idea that people should be able to do this. We don't have welfare systems and furlough and so on to fall back upon. So we were very alarmed at this prospect. When I reached out and started contacting a few people, I found one or two, particularly on social media, who felt the same way. Now, of course, the population at that stage, in terms of the people on social media anyway, the top 1% of the country were all massively in favor of lockdown because they had been propagandized to death and lapped it all up and were all deeply steeped in the drama of the novel deadly virus and all of this nonsense. And we began a program of trying to insert some reason into the policy discussion, or actually to even create a policy discussion. Stuck our hands into our pockets and launched a couple of articles into the press, which at that time was not nearly as censorious as it is now. And we got some attention, lots of vitriol and criticism, all the standard allegations of being alt-right, right-wingers, Nazis, all that kind of complete nonsense that these airheads spout. We got quite a big following, but after a few months of work, we realized that nothing that was being done in South Africa originated in South Africa, and it was pointless talking to the policymakers here. This was all coming from the outside. So we launched a process of actually seeking out an international group that was doing similar things to us. Couldn't find one, so we decided to internationalize ourselves, and we did that in a very smart order. PANDA now is quite a significant group in terms of the number of contributors over the years, the scientists of various stripes, and a huge range of articles, videos, open science sessions every week, our open society sessions every week that we, you're a regular attendee, I'm a regular attendee, and we all gain a huge amount of knowledge and enrichment from those discussions. And we continue to fight all the craziness of the COVID policy response and its many related policies, which are still very much alive and kicking.
Yes, and then emphasis on the kicking. H.L. Mencken, who's kind of the successor to Mark Twain in the U.S. Early 20th century, he said democracy is the concept by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. I'm curious, in South Africa, for instance, and potentially other parts of Africa, ostensibly there's democracy there. Did people fall in line with this? Did they obey it? I often think there's kind of a divorce between the elites and the people. How did that play out? And were you kind of surprised by the manner in which so many people jumped on board with lockdown without really that much in the way of kind of self or cross-validation?
Yes, I mean, in South Africa, the situation is the same in the sense that it was the so-called elite. I mean, I hate the term because there's nothing really elite about them other than that their own self-regard, really. But it was the elites who lapped up the media propaganda, took it all at face value, and just went headlong into the absurdity, recovering their wits only by degrees, and in some cases, never at all. But what's the difference is that in developing countries, that class of people is very thin. It's a tiny percentage of the population. when I visited the townships where normal people in South Africa live, it was totally clear that they were having none of it. They called the bullshit from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Didn't wear masks, didn't social distance, got through the whole thing in a sort of a few weeks and carried on with their lives, and just weren't having any of this. So in that regard, the society is different. And it also showed up when the vaccine mandates and vaccine pressure came along. I think we topped out at something in the region of 30% vaccinated for the whole country, 2 doses. And when the boosters came around, it dropped to like 1.5%. Almost nobody went and got.
I've often realized. Well, I thought very recently that this concept of booster. You've heard me, talk about the fact that if in fact the original vaccine had efficacy to a certain extent, and for groups with comorbidity who might have needed it, etc. But if let's stipulate that it had some value, it has succeedingly less value as the variant strains come along and they look less and less like the original actor. In South Africa, when Delta, I think Delta, originator popped up first on the, the public health awareness screen in South Africa. I believe at the time there was only about 10% vaccination, and it didn't really do that much. And yet the rest of the world went crazy. With South Africa, I've fortunately, I had on my show Nati Mladla, also from PANDA, and he tried to provide some sobriety to this, but people actually is about, I think Omicron originated in South Africa as well, and he tried to provide some perspective about that. It didn't seem to resound anywhere else. I mean, did you have any perspective about that?
About Omicron?
Well, about either of these episodes, falling in a place where there was very low vaccination rate and people did not, drop dead in the streets,
yes.
such we might have seen in
Yeah. But I mean, the bottom line is that COVID has a very low mortality rate for the vast majority of people. It's negligible. It's not a deadly virus. It's nothing novel in any reasonable sense of the word. So it's not surprising that people who are not flustered enough to get vaccinated are not falling over dying, because the deaths have a lot to do with the hysteria. They're not driven by a virus. There's a hysteria in the medical profession, hysteria in the populace. It causes people great anxiety and fear, and the doctors to indulge in a huge number of really obscene practices, isolating patients, preventing people from visiting their loved ones in the hospital, failing to treat secondary infections, dosing people up with catastrophic drugs like remdesivir and midazolam, and the list is just so long of the crazy things that were done in hospitals and outside hospitals, driving a narrative of fear, causing people to literally lose their minds with anxiety. I think one of the really under-discussed topics in the whole COVID phenomenon is the nocebo effect, the opposite of the placebo effect. If you tell people there's something deadly around and then stick a PCR swab in their noses and tell them they've got it, which is completely ridiculous, telling a healthy person they've got a disease. Then you create an environment in which they can do very poorly under any form of medical treatment. Then, the phenomenon of morbid dread is well documented. And I think a lot of people died of morbid dread. And I mean that, not just their panic, but the panic of others around them, including the medical profession, in response to what is for to all intents and purposes, for even vaguely healthy under 70s, a virus of negligible impact. And you've got to remember also that in developing countries, almost everybody's under 70.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the whole phenomenon. I've spoken about this with Dr. David Bell, about the phenomenon that it just seems to have, the concept of Passover is that God's plagues passed over the Jews. That's one interpretation, and the Egyptians got it for some reason. But, it's in terms of Africa, I guess Egypt is in Africa, but, it seems to have passed over, huge swaths of, I don't know, potentially a billion people in Africa. And we didn't really hear about the ill effects of SARS-CoV-2 in Senegal, Ethiopia, from side to side, up and down. What was up with that. I don't know exactly. I think, people are younger on average. There's, basically younger population. They're living more outdoors. There's tropical weather. They're not, confined and whatnot, and they've got bigger problems to worry about. Has there been any kind of backlash for the kind of misappropriation and the diversion of funds from more central public health measures, malaria, HIV, tuberculosis? Has there been any kind of talk about that within South Africa or elsewhere within Africa?
I think there's a popular awareness that that kind of thing went on, but there's no media backlash because we have the same situation where our media is all kept on a short and probably tightening leash. We watched as one by one the newspaper outlets that were prepared to carry our work and that seemed to be taking a reasonably balanced approach dropped, fell foul of their own economic circumstances, pressure from these creepy multinational foundations and their owners in many cases to toe the line with the false narrative of COVID. And so backlash is hard to see. If there is a backlash, it's never going to be expressed in the media. But we come off the back of an enormous state capture crisis called Guptagate, the Gupta family in South Africa who managed to infiltrate government. And I keep on telling people, you do realize that the misappropriation and corruption entailed in the COVID exercise absolutely dwarfed Guptagate. And Guptagate was splashed all over the media for months and months on end. Instead, this time around, the media got completely behind this grand exercise in theft from the working classes and the middle classes in favor of these criminal and repeatedly serial criminal pharmaceutical companies and any number of fat cat bureaucrats. These were the beneficiaries in large corporations and so on. And everybody else lost out, and the media was fully behind this, backed it all the way, knew that it was happening, did nothing about it.
So what do you think my mother used to always have this question, what's the reason, when one of her sons did errant behavior, what's the reason? What's the upside for, if we want to posit that actors wanted this to be exaggerated? Cui bono, and how did it all transpire?
Well, to begin to answer that question, you have to first accept one important fact, which is that COVID was not a medical phenomenon. So although we've been talking about infections and vaccines and death rates and that kind of thing, we actually should stop talking about that stuff and just face up to the reality that COVID was a political event. To see it as something that should be addressed by epidemiologists and doctors and so on and so forth is to just make a category error. And once you've accepted that COVID is a political phenomenon, it becomes quite easy to see the parallels between that scam and the many other scams that are continually in operation around us. I have a little, call it a rule of thumb, called Hudson's razor, that says that if anything is presented as a global crisis, admitting only global solutions, and in the presence of the suppression of dissenting voices, then it is definitively a scam. And once people have absorbed that little triptych, the three conditions, the presentation of a global crisis, admitting only global solutions, in the presence of suppression of dissent, those three things, once people begin looking for those, they of course see them everywhere. They see them in the domain of climate crisis. They see them in the domain of diet, this whole business of not eating meat, for example. They see it in the domain of the transgender debate. They see it in the discussion of even of things like gender-based violence, education systems, economics. Modern monetary theory had an electric fence. It was a protected narrative. It's completely bananas. It's a useless economic theory that's very dangerous. Yet criticism of that was actually suppressed. You would only notice it if you were an economist with his eyes open. But you start seeing all of these manifestations of narratives that suddenly appear to you to be questionable, and that's very important, because it then causes you to see the overarching themes that are common among all of these trajectories. They all drive in the direction of governance at an increasingly centralized level. So we talk about globalization, globality, and control. We talk about world government. We talk about surveillance state, biosurveillance. We talk about central bank digital currencies with programmability, allowing the government to tell you what you can and can't spend your money on, and potentially turning off your income if you say things that are inconvenient to them. We talk about digital IDs and biometric recognition in surveillance cameras, and all of this is becoming real. It's on the ground and active in some parts of the world and planned in the rest. And those plans are not hidden. They're out on the websites of these multinational organizations. That's their direction of travel. It's not too difficult to understand. It's completely immature to call them conspiracy theories, because, I mean, you're a couple of mouse clicks away from verifying everything that I'm saying. Even the very dullest of
Right.
internet searches could go and find these pages. It's not difficult.
Well, you're only a couple of mouse clicks. You're only a couple of mouse clicks away from finding that out, if the rulers allow you to have those mouse clicks. I just the other day interviewed a kind of a intellectual supervisor of the opposition movement in Venezuela. And I'm curious, how much of that interview can be filtered in Venezuela? And I'm going to leave that answer out there. But at various times, various places, those things are controlled. There's an expression that you're over the target when you get shot at, and so what I don't want to make this too far afield, but I don't know if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, but it stuck with me quite a bit. The wizard is a small guy. And he keeps literally the levers of control by having people work under the myth that he's bigger than he is, and people don't necessarily challenge it. He turns out to be a benign guy, so it's not a great analogy. But a lot of the people in power are not just small individuals, but small minds, and their actual power is small, except through this miasma, this haze, fog. It's kind of like called the fog of war, but the fog of information war. How do you see this? I mean, first of all, I don't know if you buy into my thoughts there, but what's the map and strategy how to deal with that?
Yeah, I think you're right in the small minds allegation, and this is something I only recently worked out, really. Right at the beginning of the COVID phenomenon, I was interviewed on stage at a conference, a business conference. And in the Q&A, I was asked what books I think were relevant for reading at this time. And this was early on, for definitely the sort of first third or so of the phenomenon that we've suffered through here. And I hadn't really thought of that question. And the books that came to mind were, the first one was The Gulag Archipelago. And the line that was ringing through my head there was that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. I think I've contracted it a little bit there. But that line was very important, because what I had encountered was that, I have quite a large network. In my day job, I'm a private equity investor. I've had a successful career in private equity, and had in the process generated quite a substantial personal network in country. And when I started calling those people who I normally have immediate access to, and they would be very interested to hear what I had to say, or very willing to answer my questions, I got this kind of brick wall all of a sudden. It had never happened to me before, and with respect to anything else. And I began thinking about this, that line of Solzhenitsyn's. Because what I was seeing was that people who I thought were, maybe somewhat flawed individuals had become evil overnight. And so it worried me. Now, I'm talking about people who I knew quite closely, people who I'd gone on family holidays with, long-time colleagues who I'd sort of been through difficult situations with and fought in the trenches with and so on. These people were suddenly, that in as far as I could tell, they'd lost their minds, and they were part. They'd allowed themselves to become part of an evil machinery. So I really did have to grapple with that problem. It was I was helped by the fact that I in being an outspoken member of the resistance to the COVID policy tragedy, I came across a lot of very interesting people, and so I made new friends and had was actually launched into a completely, if I can say, higher intellectual domain. I benefit from.
I would go with genuine.
It's genuine, but the quality of intellect is better. It's much better, Andy. I have the conversations that I would have loved to have had in my developmental years. No,
I think you did. I think you probably did pretty well. I mean, your developmental years were developmental. I think back. There's this word jejune, which I never could remember what it meant until I kind of came across the French word. Jeune, it's young. I don't know why they kind of stutter it, but jejune is what a lot of us go through early on, and your developmental needs experience. The COVID episode is experiential, and it serves as either a shibboleth or a litmus test for how people react. And yes, and to bring in J.K. Rowling, it's also what I call a sorting hat. When you show up at Hogwarts, I don't know, they magically, literally figure out whether you are Huff and Puff, Slytherin, or I forget what the other one, Gryffindor, or something like that. Anyway, they can figure that out. Well, the COVID and a lot of the silver lining inside our cloud is that COVID, for on a personal basis, socially and whatnot, intellectually, it became a sorting hat. Your friends self-sorted. I don't wake up in the morning and see an ogre, but a lot of people, gazing upon this lovely visage did. They saw me as ogreish because we were having outdoor barbecues. And people, came over, but just the mere fact that we played tennis in a huge indoor pavilion, I don't know, 40-foot ceilings, and somebody took a selfie of that, put it on Facebook, and her, friend network went, I don't know, figuratively, literally nuts over it. I invented, just a quick side note, I invented the thing I called the underwater hug. Everyone was leaving these events and everyone's like, goodbye. And everyone wants to hug, something like that. I said, look, you know what? When you're underwater, you hold your breath, you do what you like, and then you come up for air. Why can't we just have an underwater hug? You hold your breath over there, come in for the hug, and then you can breathe out, safe from cooties and whatever. And, so that was its own sorting out. Some people said, oh my God, that's a great idea. They come in for the hug, they went out to breathe. And some people were like, oh, can't even chance that. So if you couldn't chance the underwater hug, I don't know. So it just became an interesting, social phenomenon. I'm not happy about it because, I like a lot of the people who, don't agree with me philosophically. I like having them around. It's interesting times. And I think that's the friction by which we actually, hone our ideas, hone our minds, and so forth. And to that point, so here's a question for you. There's kind of been this centralization of thought, and this kind of siloing of what is called science or knowledge. What's been your thought about that, kind of globally, and in both senses, in the entirety of that thought, and then literally around the globe? And what are the counteractions? And are we in a, what's the barometer here? Are we in a good place or not?
No, we look, short term, we're in an extremely bad place, but I think longer term, this is all going to play out very well. I rail against the idea of centralization. It's interesting that the topic has almost been dropped from the syllabi of all the subjects where it should be discussed. So in political science and in economics and in philosophy of science, and more generally in philosophy, in the theory of knowledge, epistemology, centralization is a topic that should be heavily discussed, because It's when viewed through a number of lenses, centralization is a problematic story. One of the feeders to centralization, which I think you were alluding to, is balkanization, specialization. When you get peoples who are members or constituent parts of a highly centralized polity or institution who occupy, live life, play life out in a very narrow bandwidth situation, swim between flags that are so close together that there's no lateral movement allowed at all. I think it's a recipe for disaster. In my second interview, I think it was, so that we're talking in May of 2020, I actually pointed immediately to the balkanization problem, because what I saw was the epidemiologists putting their models together, but not consulting immunologists. They didn't know that the genome of SARS-CoV-2 had a 60% plus overlap with broadly circulating viruses, and that this meant that the majority of people would have pre-existing immunity, a substantial majority, 80% or more. They didn't know that. And so they made the assumption of universal susceptibility, and that made the models wrong by, there was a fact, just with respect to that factor, made them wrong by a factor of 5.
No, it's a craziness. I wrote on Omicron in the Daily Skeptic last October, and I think people don't realize the coronavirus was always and probably precedes human life, but as long as humans have been around, it's probably the second leading named cause of the common cold. And obviously we've only been able to name viruses within the last 70, 80 years. But even now, as Omicron, it circulates in these variant strains. So where people still show positive for a test, they call it COVID-19. There's no reason to think that. Omicron is distantly, if at all, related to the ancestral version of SARS-CoV-2 and/or original SARS, and it's probably just either a spontaneous or a relative to the other kind of regular common cold coronaviruses. And as we move from the zoonotic, more dangerous types of viruses, which presumably original SARS was, and maybe this jacked up lab version, SARS-CoV-2, a common cold has to have some ability. If something is going to be just human to human transmitted, it has to be more benign. If it's knocking everybody over like Ebola, it's not going to be that transmissible globally because humans react to it. I think a lot of what people missed out in their own silo or balkanized versions of reality is that there are interactions with others. That it's not just a virus kind of circulating upon like a bed bug going through my mattress or something like a termite going through a house. There is resistance, and people react and they do things differently according to how things play out. And so every model is a failure. And I think one of the successes of PANDA is this different approach of bringing different concepts and kind of different hats to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. You cannot discuss a complex entity like a pandemic, which I don't think this is, by the way. I think without the shift in definition to something that's totally ridiculous, COVID definitely does not qualify as a pandemic. But when you're dealing with this kind of complex phenomenon, you need to be consulting with the obvious fields of epidemiology, immunology, virology, vaccinology, etc., and then the broader fields of ecology. If I could single out one profession to thank for insights I've been given, it would be the ecologists.
Yeah.
Shortly followed by geologists, interestingly. And that's a really interesting point, because they don't really have any or very little domain overlap. Ecologists, you can understand, they need to know about all creatures great and small. But the geologists are very much in their world of rocks and minerals. But I think the reason I found them so valuable as interlocutors is that they have a sense of scale and scope and evolutionary process that allows them to stand back.
Mm-hmm.
When you're used to talking about time on the scale of millions of years being a small period of time and billions being a somewhat large, it does all put it into context. This little 3-year event is in the blink of an eye, and it's not going to leave any signal in the geological record.
Yeah. Well, sometimes those can also be historians, and I think you might be minimizing your own role. I don't think you're an ologist per se, but you're very congenial. So I just was thinking maybe you should be the congeniologist.
What I am is a career generalist. I in private equity, which is my field, you face a problem all the time of information asymmetry. When you're considering purchasing a private asset about which almost no information is publicly available, you have to have street smarts. You have to find out ways to deal with the asymmetry of information presented by the problem that the seller knows everything about the business and you know nothing. In that environment, if you don't play that game,
you have to suss things out. You will get
mixed up, and
that's experiential. And so I think that was totally missing. I've spoken a few times on my show with economist Paul Freiters, and he gives a great economic sense, similar to what you did early on. And he has a kind of his own adjusted QALY. So he's got a different name for it, which is not just the quality adjusted life years, but basically how much life you have in those life years, because it's asymmetric, like how much your enjoyment you're getting when you're 20 versus the enjoyment when you're getting, between 70 and 80. So it's not just the numerical amount, but there's kind of a difference. If you lose a 25-year-old, it's not just that there's a 50-year difference between that and a 75-year-old, but that those years are just incredibly more important. You're building a family, you're building your life, you're building your employment, all that kind of stuff. And so, this is kind of the opposite of the Spanish flu episode, wherein the younger generations got taken out, and here I had my 90-year-old mother-in-law in the basement throughout, and she survived COVID, and she survived us, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not into geronticide. But there was no perspective. I don't think she wished, she's passed us now, and may her soul rest in peace, but I don't think she wished for her, granddaughters to, never see, a possibility of a date, and to put their lives on hold when they're, 18, 19 years old, 20, and should be living. This is an incredible cruelty. And this kind of perspective, this very narrow perspective on, a death and so forth was absurd, and it was never really factored in with all the other aspects of figuring out the economics and personal economics, which I think you did very well. Is there any kind of mechanism to keep this afloat, and what do you think is the next tool in their kind of say centralization, globalization efforts?
Well, I mean, the direction of travel is obvious. It's continued scripting of narratives, the driving of polarization dynamics in populations, divide and conquer. Let the peasants fight each other instead of us. One of my favorite topics for a long time now has been the construct of left and right in politics. I think it's a completely incoherent dichotomy. I offer one, potentially among many, resolution of that problem, and that is to consider, instead of framing politics on a spectrum from left to right, framing it in terms of two spectrums, the one being liberal authoritarian. So do you believe in greater human agency, less authoritarian control, greater civil liberties, or do you believe in central powers existing that can assert control over everything from your speech to your permitted actions, to what goes into your body and so on. So there's that liberal authoritarian spectrum. And then another one, which is conservative revolutionary. There's this ridiculous idea that I think exists mainly in America, that the opposite of a conservative is a liberal. It's just totally foolish. It makes no sense whatsoever. The positioning yourself as a conservative versus a revolutionary is very much about your attitude towards complexity. People who believe that the universe is easy to understand and that complex systems like society and the weather and climate and diseases and pandemics and immune systems and ecologies are easy to understand. We can put them in models. They tend to be your revolutionaries because they've got a better way of doing the calculation and they want to change the way the world approaches those problems, and they want to do it now. That's a revolutionary. Conservatives take the approach of saying, look, these systems are bigger than us. They're complex. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and there are many unforeseen consequences, second-order effects that we don't anticipate, so on and so forth. That's what defines small c conservatism, is a humility in the face of complexity. And I think you can position people on these two axes because you very definitely get authoritarian conservatives, people who believe that their tradition is infallible and that the system within which they have been educated is right and must be imposed on everybody else. This is very much the characteristic of religious conservatives. They have a moral order, a moral system, which they want to impose. So there you go, is an authoritarian conservative. But you also get authoritarian revolutionaries, those who would impose an authoritarian order upon the world. And that, I think, is what, if you went and said, okay, these people who we loosely associate, we call them on the left, a substantial portion of the people on the left are revolutionary authoritarians. Mm-hmm. But amongst the people on the right, on the left, this loosely defined, incoherently defined group called the left are people who believe in civil liberties. RFK is one of these, I believe, and he is a liberal conservative. He seeks to conserve liberalism, meaning all of the rights and freedoms and constitutional obligations and rights that are conferred by the American system of governance. He's a believer in that system, as am I. And he wishes to see the better parts of that system perpetuated. That makes him a conservative, but a liberal one. So we can position people in all four corners of that spectrum and anywhere in between those two spectrums. It covers, obviously, you've got a horizontal and a vertical axis. So you're painting a plane. We can position people anywhere on that plane. And that, to me, starts becoming a more coherent way, in a more coherent lens through which to view our politics. I'm a conservative liberal. I'm a person who has respect for complexity, and I'm a person who has respect for civil liberties and human agency. And I go further than that. My philosophical apparatus entails believing that knowledge creation is the source of all good, and economic growth is irretrievably connected to knowledge creation, and that knowledge creation only happens by evolutionary processes, and those processes only happen under conditions of freedom and plurality. So the world stops, in my mind. We freeze over. Human flourishing becomes impossible the moment we centralize, become authoritarian. And that's where I live. I'm a conservative liberal.
Yeah, I like that. We call that classic liberal here. It's
yes.
Like classic Coke as opposed to new Coke.
It doesn't make sense though, because it's trying to recapture the original ideas of liberalism without addressing the problem that conservatism is still important. You can be both a liberal and a conservative. In the insertion of that dichotomy between conservative and liberal, it's a false dichotomy. The insertion of that into American politics did more damage than possibly anything else in history, because it teed up opposites where there are none. Nobody should be described as a conservative on the basis of where they position themselves on the liberal authoritarian spectrum. Nobody. It's a separate distinction, a regard towards knowledge creation, complexity, and the hard reality, I believe, that problems are only solved by evolutionary means, whether in the biological domain or in the economic domain. We are constrained by complexity to solving our problems through evolutionary means.
Yeah. I had on a month ago George Gilder. Are you familiar with him? A futurist, economist. He just recently, he's 83 right now, sharp as a tack, and he just recently wrote Life After Capitalism. And to cut to the chase, basically, the answer is capitalism. But he has various theses where he combines informatics with economics, and his thoughts are very similar to what you're saying. Basically, wealth is knowledge. His prime example, I guess, would be if you have the caveman or whatever, some proto-human. He has all the materials that we have, and maybe cleaner versions, clean water, clean air, all that kind of stuff, clean rocks, clean ground, and so forth. And yet he's impoverished. He's going to starve, very likely, or freeze, and so forth. Even somebody in the worst housing project is essentially better off than that person. What has happened in the interim is knowledge, and we've taken sand and we made it into computer chips. We've taken lightning and we're able to run our house and our cars on it. So that's really the concept. So if you had to leave, so actually a little bit on a quasi personal basis, I'm Jewish, and our people have moved from place to place, and people wonder, like, oh, there's so many Jewish doctors, Jewish dentists, Jewish lawyers, Jewish accountants, but they're under the pale of Russia. That in the early late 19th, early 20th century, land ownership was forbidden to Jews. So their wealth was literally knowledge. If you had to be mobile, you couldn't be tied to the ground. You couldn't be, the German. If you ever see somebody, Otto von Bismarck, if any of those kind of appellations where people are from someplace. I mean, the Jews didn't really have that. So their names ultimately became like Taylor and Goldsmith and whatnot. Their occupations. So they became what they were. And of course they got envied for their wealth, but they were sort of inadvertently forced in this corner to put that to practice, where wealth is knowledge and knowledge is wealth. And so you have that thing, and if you have to pick up and move from South Africa to Indonesia or vice versa, you will still be able to practice your art. And ironically, for doctors, that's in German, that's Arzt. And so, it's like, oh, be a doctor, you want to do this, but whatever. So, it's I don't think there's anything wrong with land ownership. And, I have my tiny little square, an eighth of an acre here. And it's wonderful. But in worse, push comes to shove, you get to move around. Just to kind of get a little bit at your dual axes of authoritarianism versus libertarian. How do you phrase the second axis? My only puzzle about
conservative versus revolutionary. Yeah.
Thank you. My only puzzle about RFK is whether he has some elements within his total portfolio that will lead to the opposite of his desired result. Because I don't think you just have kind of libertarian or liberalism in a vacuum. You need to have a preservation of rights. No. In order to do that, you have to have the ability to defend those rights. And I think he's coming around a little bit on what we have here, the Second Amendment, the ability to bear arms, and potentially some other aspects of free speech and whatnot when it comes to climate. If you don't agree with him historically, you should theoretically be jailed if you have contrary climate views. And so I imagine he's maybe evolving, to use your phrase.
He's definitely changed his mind on that. I mean, he was tweeting yesterday about how the climate crisis is being used as an excuse to exert greater levels of control over the civilian population, and that is the deep state that's doing it. That this is not the speech of a man who is stuck in the mentality of yesteryear, where he believed that people who denied global warming should be arrested, as you say. He's no longer there. And I've got bigger respect for people who move on from their erroneous presuppositions. I think it's very clear that what you're dealing with there is a person who's learning, like we all are. This phenomenon has been an extraordinary event. It's a very interesting time to be alive. I mean, I say that. I was upbraided the other day for saying this by one of my followers, who said to me, but it's not so interesting if you're one of the people who, caught the sharp end of the wedge in
No, I understand that. Yeah, and I've had a few bits of shrapnel from the woke revolution come my way, and certainly Alexander Solzhenitsyn did. The question is, how you deal with that. I mean, it's really the measure of a man. I think the worst, the may you live in interesting times, I think was some kind of curse. If you find that,
yes.
But it also, it's also the measure of a man. I mean, I think so many men in particular versus women say, wind up devolving. They wind up in a life of illusion, of drugs, alcohol, philandering, whatever, various one type of addiction or another, because they don't have the battle. They don't have the kind of whetstone upon which to sharpen their mind, their tools. Yes. And I think there's a fair amount of anomie, namelessness, that is being subjugated to the male in particular, and it's somewhat inimical to our telos, our way of being.
Purpose.
We don't wish for war, but I think if you look at any young boy, I mean, what is it they want to do? They want to act war. They want. Just one quick anecdote: when my kids were really young, 5-7 years old, we went to some party and the parent was like, oh, Johnny's not allowed to use a gun, and so 10 minutes later they're out playing, and he took some noodle, whatever, like a swim noodle, and styrofoam, and he's like, he's shooting everybody with it, and anything at hand, so there's kind of this appetite for battle that we all have, anyway. So I applaud you for having been our knight in shining armor as far as that goes. What are the other battles? How do we reform PANDA or the other iterations that are necessary to combat? Because I agree with you that the answer for Hudson's law or Hudson's razor is that the answer is always more government. Bock's razor, such as it was years ago about college education. I was like, oh my God, it can't be 4 years. It can't be in the United States. We have 4 years of college. It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean it shouldn't be? It can't be. I said, well, look, you want to become a French teacher. How many years of college? 4 years. You want to become a biologist. How many years of college? 4 years. You want to become, I don't know, a philosopher. How many years of college? 4. So if the answer is always 4 years, it obviously can't be right. It can't need the same set of tools to do all those varied things. And clearly, it's a self-serving operation for the colleges. And I think we find so many things that are self-serving for those institutions themselves. And I, for one, like Albert Finney in the Network movie, I think he screams out the window. He just can't stand it anymore. It's a tough thing. We can't make these duplicate institutions right off the bat. How do we deal with the ones that we have?
So, my starting point, and we should probably reach back to an early part of our conversation. You spoke about, is it a question of small-mindedness? And I started waxing lyrical about the question of evil, because, what I was pointing at there is, are we dealing with evil people or small-minded people? And I wanted to try and convince you that it's actually the problem is small-minded. And let's just assume I'm right. So what do you need to do? We need to get better at communicating the small-mindedness of the menu that is offered to us at this restaurant of globalism. And I think that's really important. People get upset with me a little bit when I say that, because, well, where's your strategy? Where's your grand strategy? We should have little steps, and we should do this, and then we should do that. And I say, no, the future is fundamentally unpredictable. We should try lots of things. It's knowledge. New knowledge is created by evolutionary processes. So you need to have a diversity of efforts. You need to be trying many things, and then doing more of the things that appear to work. But the one thing that I'm pretty sure will work very well is continual refinement of the tools by which we explain why the small-mindedness is indeed small-mindedness, and why the policies being proposed are downright stupid and only going to be disastrous for everybody, including, in the long run, the people who are proposing them. We need to become better at that. Just getting better and better about what we say and continuing to say it will eventually triumph. The ideas of centralizing people are amongst the worst ideas in the universe. You know, they are for the biggest abuse of the most important structure in the human in the universe, which is the human mind. And so for me, opening up this conversation, really starting to drive hard in the direction of trying to break these false dichotomies that create the partisan divides, that create the polarization in our society, is extremely important. You've got to find ways to hook people in, to engage them in a discussion. This is not going to be over in a day. Well, put it this way. All the scenarios that involve us winning in a day are terrible scenarios. They entail violent revolution. Many people will die. There will be a huge setback to humanity. We don't want that.
Right.
There's a slow process here. If we want the best sort of path and the best outcome, what we've got to do is to continue the very good job we're doing of co-opting an ever-swelling minority of people, of allowing them or offering them the tools by which they in turn can go on to co-opt more. So it's about taking our insights into the world and how society works, the phenomena that we've been through, and learning how to refine them, how to reduce them to sentences, words of one syllable is the way to put it. How to say it with increasing refinement and simplicity and sincerity. We've got that on our side. You know, the Kissingers and Fauci's and Klaus Schwab's do not have sincerity on their side. They kind of know that they're frauds. That's like one of the characteristics of the small-minded, I think, is that they behave and they're very belligerent and they go with their great ideas and they're very convinced about them. But somewhere at the back of their minds and their subconscious, they know that it's just ridiculous that they are purporting to be the people who tell the whole world how to govern itself. I think every human has some little residual kernel of self-respect that prevents them from putting themselves in the role of the arbiter, the global arbiter. So they know subconsciously that they're frauds.
No,
and
no, I think
they
people
never achieve sincerity as a result.
People can sniff that out pretty quickly. You know, we have, I would venture to say, the most interesting faces of any animals on Earth, because we can, you know, even absent language, we can pretty much tell what's going on across the world. I mean, there's, you know, facial expressions are an innate human language. So if you pop into, you know, the backwoods of Papua New Guinea, you have no verbal, you know, lexicon, literal words to exchange. It's going to be pretty obvious, you know, when they're frightened, when they're angry, when they want to kill you, and so when you're getting along. These are universal things, and we're able to do this with, you know, I mean, I did anatomy. I mean, it's just a handful of different muscles, and yet there's so much ability to tell when somebody's telling you the truth and not telling you the truth. You watch somebody on TV, you know, they say turn the volume off, and you can see kind of what's going through their mind, you know, when they're pandering, when they're, anyway. So there is that, and there's also the concept that, you know, the biggest of these regimes, these Wizard of Oz regimes, can be, you know, have the curtain pulled back, and again, that wizard was benign, but most of them are not. And I bring up the concept of, lek valenza, solidarity, and the Catholic Church, overturning, basically upending the Soviet Union. I mean, there were other elements. There was the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, Ronald Reagan. There was its own going out of money, running out of money. There's it's kind of a bankrupt idea and a bankrupt society, blah, blah, blah. But in a sense, he was the boy in the Emperor's New Clothes. He was not invested in the continuity. We need a fair number of those ingenues, the boys in that story to point out the Emperor's absence of clothing and to help get rid of some of these silos, which are the centralization that prevent the capturing of new ideas. Science, I like to point out, you have a good definition yourself. Mine is twofold. There's two aspects of science. Science is a body of knowledge that we accept as fact along the physical world, and the other is the actual process itself, which is hypothesis, testing, proof, rinse, lather, rinse, repeat. You find it. If it works, it works. Those who just the mere fact of science is settled. You're out. You're not in this category anymore. You're part of the problem. You're part of the silo, and you're basically acting as an interested party. You're self aggrandizing, and you're feeding at the trough, but at others' dereliction. The other part of centralization, without carrying this thought too far, is again from Paul Freitas. He points out that when all this kind of push to one world government is totally inimical with any ideas ever forming again. The governments that we see as the worst, the Nazi Germanys, the Stalins, those are literally totalitarian. And the key word there is total. They have the totality of knowledge. They own science. They have the totality of knowledge, and they are the they decide what is and what is not science. They decide what is and what is not knowledge. And of course, that is exactly inimical to the definition just above.
Sure. There's no process of science. The process of science is extinguished in that framework, and nothing's changed. This was the kind of approach of Stalin and Mao, and the works that they set in motion collapsed. These will also collapse. Nothing has changed. They like to tell themselves, they like to spin a yarn of, well, we have more data and greater computer power. It's nonsense. The limitation was never on data or processing ability. The processing ability one's really funny to me. If your computer's made 10% faster, you don't find better solutions to problems. You just do a computation faster. And problem solving is not about computation. It's about a creative conjecture, a new way of looking at the world, an explanation for something where before no good explanation existed. It's a creative process, and the algorithm for that creativity has never been created. We don't know how to explain creativity. So all of the data and all of the computer power in the universe, all the AIs, as they call them, AI is a misnomer, artificial intelligence, a misnomer. It's automation. All the automation, the computers and the data in the world will not help you to create better explanations for how the beautiful, complex universe that we live in works. And it's creating better explanations that is our only source of progress. So they are on a highway to nowhere. They are destined to fail. That's predestined to fail. There's nothing that can come from the centralizing impetus. And that ought to be a source of great optimism for people on our side of the fence. It really ought to be something that you process into the very core of your being. Those people will fail. And our project is to determine how they fail, not whether they fail.
Well, the only problem that I see in that is that I'm going to use the old terms of left and right. I apologize, but on the left,
for the last time.
one episode. So here we have the Supreme Court, of the United States, and if you look at the Democrat versus Republican appointees, and you just follow, you do like a little timeline graph of the decisions that come along, is almost like, let's say it's a musical staff. The Democrat appointees stay only on the bass note. They are cohesive. There's no variance. Their bandwidth as voting, they vote as a block basically. So however number there are, 5, 6, 4, 3, whatever, they're always together. And the Republican nominees are like, they're the music. They're like bouncing. So there's a bass line, boom, 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 boom. Whether it's Sotomayor or previously Breyer or previously Brennan, whatever. Through the ages, they're boom, 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 always uniformly on one side. And the Republicans, they're everywhere. And so they can't be herded. And so, the herding cats and herding cattle are different things. So if we are cats and we're out there predatory and so forth, they're cattle, they're used to being fed and grouping together and being herded. There's a certain power. I mean, you can have a cat, maybe a lion can beat, an individual lion can beat an individual cow, fine, but you get stampeded by a bunch of cattle, that tiger is going to run away and self-preserve. So, on a kind of a societal basis, how do you anneal the cats? How do you make cats stronger?
So it's so I'm a little bit confused by the analogy, to be honest. So I don't find myself having anything intelligent to say there, but I will say this, that the Republican Democrat dichotomy is also a false dichotomy. There's nothing, I look at Trump and Biden through very much the same lens. Both these ridiculous creatures who appear not to have read a book, and with no insight, and you never hear them say anything that makes you say, wow, that's a really interesting point. That's where Kennedy is, I think, unique in the field. An argument could probably be made for DeSantis, but I think Kennedy's in a different league. And he brings something that has been lacking from American politics, certainly for my adult life. He's engaging in the world of ideas. When he's asked a question, you can see immediately he's not reading off some script plonked into his hand by Pelosi or some panjandrum of the Democratic cause. And I wonder how this is going to play out, because what exactly is it of the Democrats' policies and positions that Kennedy actually engages with at all? I think he's working in an entirely different dimension. He is, to borrow a word from their own very poor philosophy of science, we are dealing with incommensurate paradigms when it comes to Kennedy and the Democratic Party. So how's that going to work? But Biden's a non-entity. He just does whatever his handlers tell him to do.
He's I forget which Soviet premier it was, who was kind of stroked out, and Chernenko maybe, one of those guys, in the post Khrushchev era, post Brezhnev era, on the way. Anyway, he's there. Basically, we have a Politburo, and I've been trying to figure out who's in our Politburo, who's actually making decisions. It's an amazing thing. It really was a brazen act to make this coalition. And again, it comes to my point that the Democrats were able to anneal. They were able to coalesce around a somebody who was a nobody, and that was purposeful. They're like, oh, he's an empty vessel, and we can fill him with whatever fruity drink we want, and we'll go on. And unlike the Republican Party, which their primaries tend to fight to the bitter end. When it was, Biden had massively lost in New Hampshire and Iowa, and he managed to get Clyburn support in South Carolina, and so he had the blacks vote for Biden, and he came out marginally ahead of there were 15 other candidates, and thereupon he kind of got anointed based on this really fix, and then Klobuchar and Buttigieg and everyone just dropped out. Liz Warren, they all just like, oh, we can't possibly stop the steamroller of one primary victory.
Yeah.
But they were all promised something. And so I think that's the thing. It's like they all, are going to get something. So they get their little cabinet posts or whatever. They get their little sinecures and they move on. And the Republicans don't really do that. I think they have more in a sense, integrity. They have more individuality at the very least.
That may well be the case. A tribe that tends to involve more mavericks than normies. That could very much be the sort of flavor of what's going on there. But there's really just nothing going on in the politics. There's nothing interesting about the policies of the Republicans or of the Democrats. Neither of them indicate any ability to grapple with
I don't want to make this all American politics and so forth, but I disagree somewhat. I voted for Trump. I voted for him again, and I was not a Trump guy. I agreed with you. I didn't think he read enough books, and I didn't think he provided enough insight. And I think there were other people within the party who did. I like Rand Paul quite a bit. I think he's very bright, articulate, and so forth. But Mr. Trump, did see things through a different lens. He saw everything through trade and fairness. And I think fairness is one of those hugely innate characteristics, like facial expressions. I saw this video ages ago. There were 4 literal toads. They have brains, I don't know, like the size of a pin. And there are 4 of them. And somebody drops one worm in front of them. And they're all kind of looking at each other. And nobody's touching it because there are 4 of them. There's only one worm. And so one guy, I'm guessing it's a guy, he grabs the worm. It's like food. Boom, he grabs it. And the other 3 pounce on him. Like, how could you do this? This was unfair. Like, we didn't get any. So I think fairness is like a total, hardwired aspect. And the concept of fair trade, as opposed to just free trade, was something that, is genuinely Trumpian. And it was a different lens. And I think there were ways in which, his opprobrium towards China resonated. And I think there were moves being made in that regard. And I frankly think, this is my conspiracy theory, I think that a lot of the ratcheting up of COVID as a response, you and I are aware of the Diamond Princess, and the data were there. I don't think Trump was. I think his failing in the COVID thing was not reading the Diamond Princess.
Yes.
And
Jeffrey, this is a problem. The problem with the enormous degree of control that the deep state exerts over your president.
But this is where you get around. And to your point, knowledge is wealth, and wealth is knowledge. And I think this is where he failed. Mr. Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone Institute, he was on a podcast with Dr. Drew in the spring and this year. But he once the Twitter account was resurrected, he went through Trump's tweets. And on March 9th, he's like, this is just another flu virus, no worse than, I don't know, the Shanghai flu, whatever. And then on March 11th, he's basically like, he's been turned. That says we have to, do lockdowns, whatever. And there's something in those 2 days that happened. And I think he looked at his calendar, whatnot, and, the National Defense Initiative, whatever, they came. I mean, we're filling in the gaps here. But his theory is that somebody came to Trump and said, this is not a normal virus. This is a Chinese bioweapon. This has been gained of function, or whatever you want to call it, and GOF'd the hell of it. And this is data, blah, 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 it's going to blur, whatever. Something happened. I don't think the information was true, but a little bit like how George W. Bush was fed the Iraq information, probably wrongly. Maybe he was manipulated. Maybe they believed it. I don't know. But there was this episode, this moment where Trump was turned. And I don't think that's his own devising. I think, unfortunately, he fell for it. And mind you, they tried 1,000 different ways to get at him. And this one, unfortunately, became his tragic flaw, in a sense, because it whipsawed him for the rest of that presidency.
And then there was a hop, skip, and a jump to Operation Warp Speed.
Yes,
yeah, okay. Let's suppose I buy that story. I still can't buy the story that the guy gets into power on a ticket of draining the swamp and dealing with the deep state, and then immediately picks a guy like Alex Azar as his Secretary of Health and Human Services. A career lobbyist from the pharmaceutical industry, a lawyer. You pick that guy? Who then goes on to
I don't think he lasted long. I don't think he wound up.
I think he lasted plenty long. He lasted long enough to do his job, which was to appoint Birx and Fauci, and then he resigned. I mean, you don't appoint a person like that if your aim is.
Well, he didn't appoint Fauci. Fauci was appointed somewhere in the Pleistocene era.
No, but in terms of his role in his role in the pandemic, or the so-called pandemic, was not appointed in the Pleistocene era. I agree with you. He's been around for decades, spinning one false narrative after the next, and practicing continual refinement of the exquisite art of corruption, for decades. But it was very necessary to get a vacuous bimbo like Birx and a career criminal like Fauci into the position.
I think that's tricky, and I'm not going to. I agree with you, but again, tragic flaw. I think it's tough. I think the government's enormous, and just as we were talking about immune reactions, how there's a virus and then the people react to the virus. I think you announced you want to drain the swamp, and the swamp reacts to you. The Russiagate thing was a total swamp rear guard maneuver, and it was diverting. It didn't win, but it won by erosion. It was a Sisyphusian type battle.
I'd say don't vote for people who can't read. That would be my honest appraisal of this. I mean, I hear you.
No, I understand.
I would
but
probably have preferred Trump. I would definitely have preferred Trump to beat Biden, because Biden is, it's just, you're not voting for Biden. There isn't a Biden.
So here's a question for you. I mean, I know something about, South African politics, but I would venture to say that you know far more about American politics. To what extent is the American election the world election? And how long is that going to happen? Are we at some point going to care about, who Xi Jinping's successor is more than the putative next after that president?
What an interesting question. You see, I rather think that the long-term future of America is much more solid than the long-term future of China. And so America will stay important in the world longer than many people elsewhere would like to believe. And I think that's mainly a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bad thing in some regards, but I'm not a what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not a hagiographer of the American biography by any means. The CIA and the American security agencies have done terrible damage to my home continent. It's a disaster. I just wish all of the spooks would disappear. So I'm really not a sycophantic supporter of American exceptionalism or anything like that. But geopolitically, from a position of heritage and tradition, I would back America any day of the week over China. Any day of the week. So I don't think that day will come that you care more about the election in China than you do about the American election. That would be, for the rest of my life, I imagine that America will still be some kind of hegemony, perhaps with less projection of soft power.
Mm-hmm. No, I think there's something there. I'm wondering what is the continued source. I've somewhat parsed it as the fact that we have a federalism. We have 50 states. People just call it the United States of America, with a little bit of emphasis on the America part. But in its formation, they were individual states, and the term was intended to be a state. Like the Secretary of State deals with foreign countries. A state is a country. And we maybe use the word country now more. So it could be the United Countries of America. But we have, retained to an extent, and again, there's kind of an annealing, kind of a centralization aspect going on, making it more of a federal entity. But insofar as we can, we have retained states' rights, which are divisible, obviously. And people are able to do more kind of crucible, individual experimentation state by state. And I think that's been a big kind of element, not quite a truth serum, but a truth helper in figuring out the right course for any of these things. And during COVID, obviously, there was the Florida and New York. They both have about the same. They each has about the same population, and Florida's demographic is older, and Florida did much better than New York State, even at times between the almost identical shaped and ethnicity North and South Dakota. I forget which one, but one had harsher rules about lockdowns and schools and masks, and there was no difference in health. So we're able to do experimentation, and I think people learn by that. And insofar as they can vote with their feet, they can vote with their wallets, they can move from place to place. So you have in and out migration between states, which is harder to do between actual foreign countries, which currently you don't need a passport to go from Louisiana to Iowa or vice versa. But if you want to go from Guatemala to El Salvador, you might.
Yeah. So I think that's a very important point. And if you gave me like a little wish list for the future of America, one of the things that would be on that wish list is a rollback of the constitutional amendments that led to a diminution of the state's power in favor of the federal government. And that's where you see what I was saying earlier about the importance of educating people to help them perceive the benefits of that decentralized system. I think you need to make, if you made that your sort of campaign position, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to educate people about the benefits of subsidiarity, of delegation of powers to states. I think then those amendments to the Constitution would come very quickly.
All right, so we're rounding out our time here, and I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of the evening. A quick note, South Africa has provinces, states.
We have a large number of provinces, and they all have their own assemblies. And that battle is fighting out in our country as well. I anticipate a massive devolution of power owing to the vacuum set up. So we're ahead of the curve relative to America. We've lived with this corruption now at a level that you guys are approaching for 30 years. And the state capacity, if you like, the federal capacity, we don't call it the federal government here, it's the national government, but I'll just talk in American terms. Federal capacity is falling apart faster than you can't even document it. It's collapsing it so quickly. And into the void thus created will flow an assertion of power and control at the level of the provinces in some cases, and at the level of nationalities in others. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have the Zulu nation in South Africa. It represents, I think, something close to a majority of the population in terms of language use as a first language. And they occupy, their population is concentrated in one geographic region. And the obstacle to their asserting power has been historically that there was a national government that asserted greater power, and that greater power has just evaporated. The state is the federal state is incapacitated, and so I anticipate a rush to fill the void, and it will be somewhat chaotic and mainly beneficial. After all, the Union of South Africa, which was formed in 1910, it was a very artificial construct, combining people of completely different stripes, all on the back of the discovery of gold around the city of Johannesburg in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So it was an artificially stitched together country, an artifact of British imperialism. It made no sense then. It makes no sense now. And that, I think that sort of arc of history, the geopolitical imperative, if you like, will convene upon a dissolution, not necessarily of the entire nation. I don't know that there will be secession movements and a fragmentation of the nation, as we've seen in places like the Sudan or the Western Sahara and so on. but we will probably see a devolution of power de facto to provincial entities. And I tell this story because I believe it's of interest to an American audience. I think this could be very much the kind of path that you go down, even though there's much more homogeneity in America. There was a book I read as a teenager called The Seven Nations of North America. I forget the name of the author right now. It wasn't Alvin Toffler, but it was one of those, somebody of his ilk, a kind of,
Futurist.
public intellectual of the 1980s. Yeah. And in this book, he described this distinct nations in America. And I then, after reading that book, ended up living there. And I could see those independent nations. Mm-hmm. But the distinction between those nations is a small story compared to the distinctions that operate in the rich complexity of the South African milieu. Mm-hmm. But I think they will still be important. The difference between California and Texas these days is vast.
Well, we'll see. A lot of Californians just moving to Texas, so we always have that. We always have that smushing around. Yeah. So okay. I'm gonna before we end, and I just do a shameless self-promotion. I've got a book out. So for those who want to support my podcast and efforts here, this is my book. It fortunately has a picture of me on the cover. The title is Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's coming out in Brazil right now, and you can buy it on Amazon. I think it's a fascinating topic. I'm not going to spend much time talking about it here, except to say that I think there are certain themes that we discussed that are evident in the book. And I think Zika microcephaly is a kind of a little Fabergé egg, a little perfect entity of what happens within a pandemic. And it's far enough away that we can actually look at it, like a little bit like the moon. It's out there and we can examine it. It's fully formed, it's inert, and we can look at it if anybody wanted to. And fact of the matter is, I'm not proud of this, but I'm almost literally the world's only doubter of the Zika microcephaly pandemic. It doesn't mean I'm crazy. I mean, you can interpret as you will. But people should look into this because they would have a little bit more humility, as the word you mentioned early on, about their concepts and their ideas and how they play out. Now, it doesn't seem like a big deal from our vantage that Zika, may or may not have caused microcephaly, and it's gone away and nobody cares. But there's two things that I want to just bring up. One is that it was used politically in Brazil. The WHO-inspired doctors recommended a birth moratorium to stop having birth through Latin America until they could have a vaccine. They didn't have warp speed. There's no vaccine. There's no vaccine still. And probably worldwide, at least 500,000 babies' souls did not come into being because of their fear, the panic, and all that kind of stuff. These are people who will not be walking around and breathing the air anytime. A and B, there is going to be a Zika vaccine. They're actually injecting and infecting women in Baltimore via Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Medicine, Public Health, with Zika to produce a Zika vaccine, because that seems to be the most powerful motivator and generator to produce a vaccine. Whereupon, this is my conspiracy theory part, whereupon as soon as it's produced within the year, it's going to be mandated by WHO to fix a problem that actually is not in existence. But this kind of axis, regulatory capture axis between big pharma and big public health, they'll benefit, whereas the people will notice no difference because Zika doesn't actually cause microcephaly. Zika is real. It's a dengue virus. Microcephaly is a real problem. Small heads, very rare, but one doesn't cause the other, hasn't gone anywhere else, and even in Brazil since that time. Anyway, that's my thing. People should read the book.
I'll do a plug for your book as well. That's a good way to deploy $10. You're a good thinker, and what you've had to say about Zika is fascinating. So all the best with the sales of that book, and I'd encourage everybody listening to buy a copy. It's a worthwhile cause to support and a worthwhile book to read. I'll plug myself quickly, or at least PANDA, the nickname for pandata.org, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. We're furiously investigating all these political connections that we mentioned with a view to helping our audience navigate this terribly complex environment, understand what it is that we're up against, and how we can best navigate it. So please take a browse of our website and the comprehensive battery of articles, videos, and media presentations there, and give consideration to lending support to our research efforts. It's a very well-governed, tightly governed, non-profit organization with none of the directors earning a cent out of the project. We all net contributors, not net beneficiaries monetarily. And so your money does not go into admin or bureaucracy. It goes straight into the projects which have, I believe, enormous potential to alter the trajectory of history.
Well, that's wonderful. I've benefited, and if you have a place to donate, is that on the webpage?
It's on the webpage. There's a donate button, and we accept very gratefully donations, large and small. Annuity donations do help us, so consider making the $100 donation $10 a month, and we'd greatly appreciate it.
Well, I personally have very much benefited from the guidance and the sharing of thought, and I know my mind has been honed by meeting various members and along some of the types you've mentioned as well. So it's been a fascinating thing. I'm very much grateful for your coming on today, but moreover for your efforts. And it's been a fabulous journey, and I thank you so much. And that really from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you very much for all of your contributions. And yeah, I certainly always enjoy seeing your face in those meetings and listening to your comments and questions. They are a delight, aren't they? I mean, it's just you know, I have a very busy schedule, and I somehow get it right to attend the vast majority of those meetings because something always happens.
Oh, absolutely. It's been great. So thank you so much. Goodbye to everybody else. You and I can chat for a second, but I call it a day.